Hi, my name's Jeff Noonan, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about an instrument that I play, this instrument right here, the lute. As we talk about the lute, I'm going to talk about different aspects of musical culture in the Renaissance as well. The lute is an ancient instrument. It dates back in Europe well into the Middle Ages and in the Middle East before that. A lute is an instrument that is pretty easily identified. First off, it has this large bowl back body made out of single strips of wood. It has a neck like a guitar, an extension on it like a guitar. The shape is sort of like a pear, almost a pear shape. And then what we call the headstock, where the strings are tied on at the top, is kicked back at an angle from the neck. Those are the characteristics of a lute. This pear shape, the bowl body, the kickback headstock. There are varieties of lute all over the world. This happens to be the lute that was played in Europe from the Middle Ages well into the Baroque era. The lute is set up much like a guitar. It has a sound hole in the middle. The decoration in the middle of the sound hole is called a rosette, which is the same term that's used to describe the big round stained glass windows in European cathedrals. So this has the same sort of decoration, if you will. This is all carved out of the top. Like a guitar, the lute has a bridge. In this case, the strings are tied onto the bridge. They extend up the neck and they go to wooden pegs that are similar to those used to tune a violin or a cello or a viola. Notice also that the lute, like a guitar, has frets. What's interesting about the lute's frets is that they're tied on, so that when I tune my strings, I can also tune my frets, the very, very fine tuning with that. The lute was used in Europe, well, as I said before, from the Middle Ages on. It probably came into Europe from the Middle East. It is a direct descendant of this instrument here, which is called an oud. That's apostrophe U-D. Oud means wood, so it denotes that this particular instrument has a wooden top. Notice that the oud is very much like the lute. It has the bowl body, it has the pear shape, it has the kickback headstock that you would see on all lutes. The oud doesn't have frets. It has, this particular one has fret markers. It doesn't have frets. Frets were added in Europe when the oud came. The oud is typically played not with the fingers in the right hand, but with a plectrum, sort of like an electric guitar is played today. The early lute in the Middle Ages was played with a plectrum, but eventually lute players began to play it with their fingers. The lute was one of the most popular instruments, probably the most important popular instrument during the Renaissance, for a couple of reasons, both of which are associated with the musical values of the Renaissance. For the Renaissance, the voice was the most important instrument, if you will. It was mankind's way of imitating what the angels did in heaven, that is, sing praises to God. So the lute was important in that, one, it could imitate the voice by playing what we call counterpoint music, where the voices go back and forth. That little piece that I was playing at the beginning illustrates that. You can hear that it sounds almost like two instruments playing a duet. You can hear the voices going back and forth. That made the lute very valuable to musicians in the Renaissance. One, because as they were composing pieces for the voice, they could try it out on the lute, but also because the lute then stood in, if you will, for the choir. The second reason that the lute was very popular, again, is associated with the voice, is because the lute is a very quiet instrument. You notice it is a very, very quiet instrument. And it is, therefore, a perfect instrument to accompany the voice. It can't get so loud that it'll overpower the voice. And lots of composers, lots of performers created songs for voice and lute accompaniment. Sometimes solo voice, sometimes groups of voices, 2, 3, 4 voices singing accompanied by the lute. Now, you might say, well, the lute kind of looks like a guitar, it kind of plays like a guitar. It is played with the guitar, with the fingers plucking here and fretting up here, but it's not a guitar. In the Renaissance, this was a guitar. So what are the differences between this instrument, the guitar, and the lute? Pretty striking if you take a look at them. First off, you'll notice the lute has that pear-shaped body. The guitar has a figure-8 shaped body. The lute has the big bowl back. The guitar has a flat back. Both the instruments have rosettes. You can see the sound hole and the rosettes in both. Both instruments have a bridge at the bottom where the strings are tied on. Both instruments have pegs where the strings are tied on at the top. Notice, however, that the peg box on the guitar goes straight. The peg box on the lute is kicked back. Notice also that on the lute, the pegs go through the side of the peg box, whereas on the guitar, the pegs go through the back. These are the differences between the guitar and the lute. Now, in the Renaissance, the lute and the guitar were played together. They also played the same kind of music, and later on I'll play a little bit of music on the Renaissance guitar for you so you can hear what the instrument sounds like. Professional lute players, whether in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, could read standard musical notation and would play music from standard musical notation. But around 1500, lute players developed a particular style of notation specifically for the lute. It made organizing the chord shapes, organizing the counterpoint on the lute much easier to read, and it also allowed lute players to play that music on any sized lute. We'll talk about the size lutes a little bit later. This is a piece of that early notation. It's called tablature. Some of you play guitar, you've seen guitar tablature. This is where it came from around 1500. You'll notice that there is a musical stave, but unlike modern musical stave, this particular one has 6 lines instead of 5 lines. Those 6 lines correspond to the top 6 courses, the top 6 sets of strings on the lute. You'll notice that instead of notes on that musical stave, there are numbers. In this case, these numbers tell me where to put my fingers. So a 0 tells me that I'm not going to put anything down on the string. A 1 will tell me to put my first finger down. A 3 will tell me to put my third finger down. Up above the musical line, you'll notice that there are music rhythm signs. These signs tell me what sort of rhythm to play. It looks very complex, but it's actually very easy to read from once you learn how to do it. This particular type of tablature, which uses the numbers, is called Italian tablature, and it was popular in Italy and in Spain throughout the 16th century. There's another version of tablature called French tablature, which instead of using numbers, uses letters. The letter A is an open string, that is, I don't put any fingers down. The letter B is the first fret, the letter C, second fret, and so on and so forth, using the letters as opposed to using the numbers. French tablature was used, obviously, in France, but also in England. Germany had its own unique, German lute players had their own unique tablature, which is rather complex, and we're not going to get into that here. I'm going to show you now some examples of lute tablature. Notice that some of these are printed and they're very easy to read. Notice also that some of them are handwritten. They're manuscripts. Some of the manuscripts are pretty easy to read. But I'm going to show you a couple of examples of manuscripts that get more and more difficult as the lute player got sloppier and sloppier. If a lute player was copying out a piece of music for him or herself, oftentimes they didn't worry about how neat it was because they were doing it for themselves. They could understand their own handwriting. But the prints and some of the better manuscripts are much, much easier to read. So here are some examples of lute tablature, both Italian and French lute tablature. Although the lute has certain parallels to the modern guitar, in not only in the way that it's played, but in the fact that it was incredibly popular and used all over Europe in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, it was not a folk instrument. It was a very sophisticated instrument. You can see by the construction it's very sophisticated. It was an expensive instrument, relatively speaking, and it was played by professional musicians or by noble amateurs who would hire the professional musicians to teach them how to play. So it wasn't a general folk instrument. It was used to entertain people at court or in well-off homes. There would be lutes and people would have them. And lutes were prolific. Almost every household had at least one lute so that people could make music. Remember back then there were no recordings, so if you wanted to make music you had to do it yourself. How popular was the lute? I have a list here of an inventory from a lute shop in Venice from the 1580s. This is just one shop in one town, and I'm just going to go through part of it. 140 lutes of diverse yew, that's a kind of wood, and flamed maple. 12 lutes made with ivory. 100 ordinary lutes. 110 lutes made of fancy yew. 10 lutes of alternating sandalwood and ivory, that's the decoration on it. 4 lutes entirely made out of ivory. 900 ordinary strings for the lute and the violin. 40 dozen thin strings. 100 dozen bad strings. 100 lute bridges. 90 lined lute cases. 80 unlined lute cases, and so on and so forth. You can see there were hundreds of lutes in this one shop in Venice in this particular year. You multiply that by the number of cities and towns across Europe that had luthiers, lute builders, and if all of them had several hundred or more lutes, there are thousands and thousands of lutes that were made and played across Europe. Lute builders during the Renaissance built, as I said, thousands and thousands of lutes, but they didn't all come in one shape and one size. This particular instrument that I'm playing here is called a mean lute. Not mean because it's nasty, but mean because it's in the middle. It's kind of a middle of the family lute. This particular instrument has 7 courses, a single top string, which is very typical, and then 6 double strings below. During the Middle Ages, a typical lute would have had 5 courses, a single top string, and then 4 courses below. Around 1500, a typical lute would have had 6 courses, that is, a single top string and 5 doubled strings below. This particular instrument that I'm playing is sort of a mid-century, mid-16th century lute, and it has 7 courses, single top string, and then the doubled courses all the way down with an additional bass note to it. Now, not only did instruments grow in terms of how many strings they had on them, but in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, instruments were built as families. Some of you may be familiar with the recorder, which comes in the sopranino, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and even great bass sizes, going from the very high sopranino all the way down to the super low great bass. I think you have to stand on a chair to play a great bass recorder. It's about a 6-foot long instrument. It's pretty amazing. Lutes also came in families. And keep in mind that the human voice, because it's the model instrument, if you will, for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the human voice served as a model for the instrument. So we have lutes that are mid-range sounding, mean lutes. We also have bass lutes, like this one. You'll notice that this particular bass lute is built just like my mean lute. It has the pear-shaped body, has the big bowl back, has the kickback headstock with the tuning pegs, has tied-on frets up the neck. You will notice that the body is a lot larger. You'll notice that the neck is a lot longer. That allows me to play very low bass notes on that with longer, fatter strings. This particular instrument is a late 16th century instrument. And how do we know that? Well, because it has not 6, not 7, but 8 courses on it. Over the course of the century, builders added more and more bass notes to the instrument to give lute players an expanded range. In fact, by the end of the 16th century, lutes of 9 and 10 courses were not uncommon. This is not a bass lute. This is a mean lute, like my little one, but it has 10 courses on it. And again, notice that the courses are all, the added courses are all on the bottom. Just for the record, there are 19 strings on this particular instrument. So that's a lot of strings to maintain and to keep in tune. Very complex instrument. But as we get closer and closer to the 17th century, the beginning of the Baroque era, music began to change, and the bass line became very important for Baroque music. Lute players wanted to keep up with the changing musical styles, so they had lute builders add extra bass strings so they could keep up with that. Lute technique is very much like that of the modern guitar. In the early days, when the lute first came into Europe, it was played as the oud was in the Middle East, that is, with a plectrum. Sometimes the plectrum was made out of quills, feathers from an eagle or from a crow, from a large bird. Sometimes sticks of wood or sticks of ivory carved and polished. In this case, I'm using a string, an old string that I've wrapped up to make a plectrum. And this was another way of playing. And with a plectrum, you get a very, very bright percussive sound. Sometime around the late 1400s, lute players began to play more and more with their fingers, like a modern guitarist, folk guitarist, or classical guitarist, that is using the thumb and the fingers to pluck. You'll notice that the sound with the plectrum is very, very bright, whereas the sound with the fingers is a lot quieter, a lot more subtle. The other thing that playing with the fingers allows a little bit more easily is that you can play chords, or you can play moving lines that go where you have different voices moving around against each other. And this is one of the most important characteristics of the lute, which made it the most popular instrument during the Renaissance. Stop talking and play a little bit of music for you. I'm going to play 3 pieces for you as an introduction, so you can sort of see what the lute sounds like and see some of the aspects of the music that I've been talking about. The first piece I'm going to play is an anonymous prelude. It's a series of single-line running melodies or scales. Notice that although it is single-line melodies, they kind of overlap, and it almost sounds as if there are multiple voices or multiple instruments playing these scales, these running passages back and forth over each other. The second piece I'm going to play is called a Scots tune. It's also an anonymous piece. It's from a collection put together by a young girl named Jane Pickering. It's from the Jane Pickering Lute book. A couple things to notice about this Scots tune. One is Scottish, so notice that the bass line in here is kind of a drone. It almost sounds like a bagpipe. The second thing is I'm going to play the piece twice for you. The first time I'm going to play it as it's written in the manuscript. The second time I'm going to decorate or ornament the melody. So you'll still hear the melody there, but you'll notice there are little twiddles and little things, trills, or what we call mordents, where we add just to decorate the note. This was a standard part of all musicians' skills during the Renaissance. And like jazz players today will take a melody and decorate it. You can still hear the melody, but you notice that they've added notes, filled things in. That's what I'm going to do with this piece. The last piece I'm going to play for you is a brawl. It's a type of dance. And I wanted to play this for you because a couple of things. One is that the lute is so quiet and the lute is so kind of dark sounding. A lot of people think, well, it's only good. The lute is only good to play soft, slow, or sad music. In fact, lutes were used to play all sorts of music, including very, very fast dances. And you can imagine that a group of dancers, a small group of dancers, could have danced very easily to this little brawl. So here are 3 anonymous lute pieces from an English manuscript at the end of the 16th century.